much, Dave, for that. Believe it or not, Dave doesn't enjoy anchoring our services. I do not know why, but I just feel so well pastored through all of those things. And I'm already part of a gospel community, so I won't be coming for your free food. But if you're not a part of one, please do. Good morning to you all, and to you guys who are joining us online, as well as Dave said that we are actually in this year-round series that we'll be in called A Life of Significance. And so we're in our third week of this particular series. And so we kicked off in week 1 looking at how a life of significance must be founded on God's salvation. And so you've got to be someone who receives new life, new birth in Jesus Christ that God is offering to your soul to begin to live with greater significance for God. Then last week we looked at not only does God start us off on this life and this journey of significance through his salvation, but he's actually there right beside you, guarding you for in this salvation, the salvation. And so God is providing everything you need as he watches over your soul for life and godliness as you walk out the salvation that he has gifted and brought to your life by the grace of Jesus Christ. And so I don't know about you, but I found that deeply encouraging as a Christian, knowing that this Christian life is not a life that I ought to actually figure out on my own, but God is right there beside me, guarding over my soul. And so that means all the challenges and trials that I may face in this life will not spell my end. Will never spell my end, as long as God's guarding power is watching over me. And so we ended last week on the note that God is guarding us in this salvation for its future fulfillment. Simply meaning to us that God will see to it that you make it all the way home. Once he has called you to be a member of his family, that ought to cause your soul to erupt in joy. Joy as you comprehend the commitment of your great God towards you in saving you. And so that's where we'll pick up this week, at this joy that must actually permeate the Christian life. And so if you have a Bible, come with me in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 to 7. And so Peter writes, and he says this: "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." And so at first read, you would think that Peter has gone off his rocker. Because if you understand a little bit of the context of these churches that he's writing towards, of the hostility and the threat that they are under, then one wonders to say, well, what are you meant to be rejoicing in? And so you look at verse 6, he says this, in this. And so what is he referring to? What is he referring in this that you ought to be rejoicing in? He's referring to the foundation of God's salvation that we've seen in the previous verses, and the fact that God is guarding over you. In that you rejoice. And it's not just a temporary joy, a joy that you ought to experience. No, it is a lifelong a long journey of joy in the Lord. Because when he talks about, in the verse, though now for a little while, that's actually a euphemism to refer to the entirety of their earthly lives. And so these various trials that they are being grieved by may last the entirety of their lives. And so again, you could be asking, well then, where do I find joy if that's actually my lot in life? And Peter's saying, in this, the foundation of your salvation that God has brought to your soul, the fact that God is guarding you in that, that's where your joy ought to be found. And so the first thing we ought to actually pick up and notice from this verse is that true joy in life isn't rooted in you or your circumstances, but it is rooted in God's vested interest in you. In other words, the equation of true joy in life is not me plus my circumstances. Instead, it is me plus my circumstances times by God's vested interest in me. amid my circumstances. That equals true joy. That's what equals true joy. And Peter's saying that ought to be a lot. We ought to be experiencing this joy. Now, someone may object and say, sure, if God is that invested in my life and in my circumstances, then why? Why this much suffering that I'm under? Why all these trials? Where is the power of God in my life, at work in my life? And that's where this exhortation from Peter to rejoice actually ought to take hold. Because what Peter is calling us to do is calling us to see both the plan and the subsequent perspectives of God's vested interest in our lives that ought to bring us great joy. And so there is a plan, and there is subsequent perspectives that we ought to embrace, that we ought to see if we're to be people of true joy as we navigate this life amid our circumstances, amid our challenges and suffering, to true joy in the foundation of our salvation. And so last week, we spoke about how God's power is guarding us in the salvation through our faith. And so in other words, you've got to be trusting in the power of God that is actually seen in the truths of the resurrection, supremacy, and headship of Jesus Christ. And so you've got to be believing in those things, trusting in those things to actually protect you, guard over this deposit of faith that God has placed in you. But if it is through our faith that we actually somehow appropriate these truths, their reality, their guarding power of our lives, then it follows that your faith needs to be of the greatest quality in order to be appropriating these truths, in order to be resting in the guarding power over your soul. And so your faith needs to be nourished. It needs to be grown so that you will be able to truly depend on God's power that is guarding you. And so God is powerful enough to guard what he has deposited in you through salvation without your efforts. He's powerful enough to do that. But instead, he would much rather have that you believe that he is that powerful. And so God doesn't want you to stand on the sidelines and just be indifferent as to whether he can actually guard this deposit of salvation he's placed in you. No, he wants you to participate in it. Participate in that process, to grow in your trust and belief that he can guard over your soul. So he wants you to be part of that process. And that's what he is up to. And so what then we are seeing that our trials and our circumstances and challenges have an intended divine purpose to them. An intended divine purpose to them. Verse 7 tells us what it is. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, and then skip down to the end of the verse, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so all that verse is telling us is so that your faith may prove to be the real thing. That's what God is desiring, that your faith will prove to be the real thing. And so hence why he allows for things to come, to trials and difficulties to test us. God is giving you an opportunity to develop and grow your faith through the circumstances of your life. Now, in a moment, we'll talk about what is meant by this praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. But for now, just note that it is the outcome of genuineness of faith. It is the outcome of genuineness of faith. And so our faith in God isn't an abstract concept, but it ought to bear outcome in the day-to-day activities and circumstances of our lives. This verse is saying that we will be a people that bear the genuineness of our faith in our everyday life. And Peter will actually press us on that in the coming chapters, that we'll be really a people that we can see the genuineness of our faith in our everyday circumstances. And so to that end, therefore, God allows various trials, suffering to come our way. For what purpose? What is the plan beyond it? So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so what is he saying? He's saying that like fire is to gold, so are our trials and circumstances to our faith. What is the plan in it? The plan is simply this, the first point, that the plan is to refine the proven genuineness of your faith. That's what God is up to. That you will be refined, that your faith will be refined so that it will prove to be the real thing. That's the plan that God is undertaking in our lives. Now, if you're familiar with this text, I don't know about you, but I used to actually read this text and actually shudder at that reality. Why? Because in the Bible, the whole idea of fire is usually connected to condemnation and God's judgment. And so I used to read over this text and think that what this text is actually saying is that actually God is looking to punish you because of your disobedience and undealt sin in your life. And so my pain, my suffering, my struggles, my failures are just a way of which God is handing to me what my sins deserve. And so the fact that God is using this refining fire over my faith is somewhat vindictive. That's how I used to understand it. But that is actually a misinterpretation of the point of the analogy that Peter is using. And if you misinterpret the analogy, then you'll end up actually missing the heart of God beyond why he allows trials and circumstances to come your way. And so think about it in this way. No jeweler puts his gold through fire to try to destroy it, does he? Not at all. Puts gold through fire to do what? That through that refining process, it will burn away the impurities that is within it, so that the integrity of that gold will prove to be pure and be used for his intended purpose. Likewise with our God when it comes to our faith. God is not allowing various trials and circumstances to come your way so that he will destroy the lives of the saints. Not at all. But like the jeweler who's careful, watching the whole process, ensuring that the temperature will bring about the intended purpose of refining the gold, so is your God watching closely over this process of trials and suffering that is coming in your life. Why? He wants to see your faith withstand. That he wants to see your faith withstand. And so from God's perspective, your trials, your circumstances, your suffering is always under control as he watches over that whole process to ensure that your faith will prove to be genuine. And so your faith is like gold in the hands of the universal jeweler. He would have it be pure. And so that's why he allows circumstances to come in your life, so that your trust in him, your dependence on his plan and purposes over your life will prove to be of the purest quality, to be fashioned into a masterpiece that displays the splendor of his craftsmanship. That's God's plan through our circumstances and our suffering. And so once you begin to see your trials and suffering in light of that plan, then you begin to find the space to actually rejoice in God's commitment to serving you. And so to rejoice in that way, we need to adopt and embrace the perspectives that actually unlock joy in your salvation. The perspectives that would unlock joy in your salvation. And so there are three of them. Number one, the perspective of peace through the refining process. The perspective of peace through the refining process. So whenever you're going through things in your life that feels like fire, you got to rest and find peace in knowing that you are like gold in the hands of your Father, who's allowing for that to happen in your life, not to destroy you, but to refine you through it. And so be at peace. Now, easier said than done, for sure, right? But we've got to be asking ourselves, why are we so prone to lack peace during times of trial? Why are we so prone to actually lack peace during our times of difficulty? And I think if we press our hearts in those moments as to what's causing this great unsettling within us, we will actually discover a root cause of fear in the midst of that. That it is our fears, that our circumstances and our trials would overcome us. We fear that they might never come to an end, or we fear that they actually may just be our end. So we are fearful of our circumstances in that way. But a calibrated perspective that actually thinks about the fact and realizes that no jeweler puts his gold through the fire to destroy it, but to have it refined, causes us to find peace. Peace in the midst of our trials, knowing that we are that precious in the hands of our caring Father. And so you've got to wrestle and speak these kind of truths about yourself and your relationship with God to your fears amid your trials, so that it will begin to unlock joy in every circumstance you may find yourself in. You've got to fight to rejoice amid your tribulation. Why? Because you remember what the Lord Jesus Christ has said about tribulation and in this life. Look at what he says to his disciples in John 16. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. And so where is peace to be found? In Jesus. You find true peace in Jesus. In the world, you will have tribulation. And so what is this world got in store for us? Tribulation, pain, and suffering. But take heart, I have overcome the world. And so the one who holds peace has overcome this world of tribulation. Therefore, you can find peace in Jesus amid your circumstances and begin to unlock true joy through the ups and downs of your life. Second perspective, the perspective of patience. That it will take just as long as it needs to take to burn away whatever needs to be refined. Hence patience. Patience. And so Peter doesn't tell us much. He's so broad in his description about the refining process of our faith through our trials. He's broad about it. All he tells us is that it will be like gold through fire, but he doesn't tell us more, doesn't give us more detail as to what needs to be burned away, for how long, at what temperature, when will we know when it's all done. Doesn't give us any of that detail. If you think about it, all the kinds of details that we like to obsess about. And hence, the human heart's cry during times of despair is always what? How long, oh God? How long must I actually endure this? Now, maybe some of us are actually prepared to actually endure much difficulty and suffering in this life, but aren't always under that one condition, right? That it shouldn't take too long. Or else we'll become impatient and start to actually lose our joy, right? And so what this is trying to tell us, this whole analogy is trying to say to us is simply this: listen, it's not the gold that dictates what it needs to be refined of, or for how long that process will take. Not at all. And so the same applies to our faith. We've got to entrust ourselves into our loving God's hands. Trust that He cares, that He is attentive to your circumstances, to your trials. And He won't pull you out a moment too soon or leave you in a moment too late. But He's watching over that process. And so therefore, what do we need to do? We need to surrender to God's timeline in refining the proven genuineness of our faith. You've got to surrender that to God's timeline. And in that timeline, you bet that God's presence might seem like it is evading you. You bet that perhaps you may be wondering, has God actually forgotten about me? But He hasn't. Now, why would I say that boldly? Because think about Job, a man who was much accustomed to suffering and trials, and think about what he actually concluded when he thought about where's God's presence, where is God's goodness in the midst of our trials. And so he, speaking about it, here's what he says. He says this: behold, I go forward in the midst of his trial. I go forward, but He is not there. Who's He? God is not there. And backward, but I do not perceive Him. On the left hand, when He is working, I do not behold Him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see Him. But, now listen very carefully to what he concludes. He, that is God, knows the way that I take. He knows it. He's understanding it all. And when He has tried me, tested me, I shall come out as gold. I shall come out as gold. There is the perspective of patience. Patience in knowing, again, that you are being handled. You're being handled by the loving and caring hands of your God. He's handling you through it all. And you can trust. You can trust as you remain patient through the whole process that He will see you be refined for the intended purpose that is at work within you. And so we see the perspective of peace, the perspective of patience, and then lastly, the perspective of perseverance, amassing glory, honor, and praise for Christ while you wait. Now, the perspective of perseverance is slightly different to patience in that it is requiring that you be proactive whilst you wait. And so if Peter is telling us that our circumstances, our trials, and our suffering is actually meant to yield praise and glory and honor at the return of Christ, then it is telling us that while you wait, you then ought to be living for what should result in terms of this final outcome. And so you should be somebody who's actually persevering to lead your life in such a way that it will reap glory, praise, and honor for Jesus Christ. You ought to be persevering in that amid your trials and circumstances. Now, amassing glory and praise and honor for Jesus Christ isn't a heavily minded concept that is of no earthly good to Peter. Not at all. He really believes that that way of living leads to practical commitments in our lives, to lead our lives in a certain way through various kinds of commitments that we'll see in his letter. And so it means that you ought to be a person who's committed to holiness, a commitment to being the embodiment of Christ through his church, a commitment to be good citizenship in our land, that you ought to be a good citizen, good South African, or whoever you are in South Africa, like you ought to be a good citizen of the land. A commitment to being faithful in what we do, and then a commitment to faithfulness in our homes. It is in those kinds of practical areas that we ought to be persevering in, amassing as much glory and honor and praise for Jesus Christ. Even though they will prove to be frustrating, because our efforts will be frustrated through our trials, through our suffering, through our pain, through our sin, we ought to be persevering in those kinds of areas. And as we do so, what we will see emerge is a life of great joy to the praise and glory of our God. And so here's the concluding question. Are you rejoicing in your salvation? Are you rejoicing in your salvation? Now, for some of us here this morning, the question needs to be, have you found joy in the salvation that God is bringing to you? And perhaps you haven't yet. Surrendered, embraced this new birth that God is offering you through Jesus Christ. And so we would love to engage with you with that. That is always our cry and our heart for every person who does not yet know, who has not yet found Jesus Christ. We want to engage with you and wrestle with you through that. And so we invite you after the service, come and engage with us over this joy that may be found in Jesus Christ. But if you're here today and you're somebody who has found Jesus Christ, then I would challenge you not to answer that question by yourself. Instead, ask the people closest to you as to whether you are somebody who is truly rejoicing in the salvation that God has brought through to your soul through Jesus Christ. Ask them and say, hey, would you say that that's evident in my life? That I am someone of joy in the salvation that God has brought to my soul. And whatever answer they will give to you, whether it's yes or no, or maybe up and down, depending on the day, then I want to encourage you then to actually think which of those three perspectives of peace, patience, perseverance, what you then need to press in on more in order to experience the fullness or a greater level of joy in your salvation through Christ by the grace of God. Let me pray for us. Father, I think about David crying out after he sinned in Bathsheba, asking that you will begin a great work of renewal and revival in his heart. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew the right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, O God. Take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of your salvation. I pray that will be our heart's cry. Whether we are heading down paths of rebellion away from you, much like David had done, or whether we are finding ourselves in just a space or a season where we are neither hot nor cold, or whether our heart is longing for, burning to actually live for you wholeheartedly. I pray that for each and every single one of us, you will restore unto us the joy of our salvation, and that we will walk and live lives to your glory. Pray that we would embrace your plan to refine the genuineness of our faith. And in the midst of that refinement, that we will fight for peace, that we will fight for patience, that we will be people who will persevere, so that this joy of the salvation that you're bringing to us will be evident. For it is on that foundation, on that joy, that our lives of significance needs to rest and be dependent upon, to your praise and glory. And all God's people say, amen.